Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be thinking about Bach's four-part harmony style. And this is most clearly revealed through his harmonisation of chorales. So music students all over the world are often asked in exams to present a harmonisation of a chorale melody in the style of Bach, because not only is it telling us something about the style of Bach, it's also revealing good practice when it comes to writing four-part harmony. So Bach inherited these chorales, these hymn tunes, as part of his work as a musician in the German Lutheran Church, and he set about reharmonizing them because the original harmony, to be honest, wasn't that great and he couldn't stand it. So he set about reharmonizing them with some more interesting harmony. So there's a lot we can learn from that. And then the task that music students often face is the one that's kind of looking at us on the screen now. Here's a couple of phrases of one of these Bach chorales, and the challenge would be to harmonise that in the style of Bach. So we're writing for voices, sopranos, altos, tenors and basses, so four-part writing. Now, one thing just to notice very quickly is you might see these pause marks, what we sometimes call the fermata, and the fermata is usually something we use to indicate a pause in music, but it's also in a Bach chorale indicating the end of a phrase. So when you see one of these things, just think that's the last note of a phrase. So we've got two phrases here, and we need to think about those because we need to plan our cadences and our keys. So before you get writing, and the challenge is to kind of just get going straight away, it's worth just thinking through, okay, which key are we in? What's happening with any modulation, with any key change? So we look at our key signature and we think there's one sharp. So this piece is either in G major or in the relative minor, which is E minor. Well, we look at the first two notes and we see GG. So the chances are that that's the tonic of G major rather than something else in E minor. When we come to the end of the second phrase, it finishes on a G. So there's a lot saying G major. If it were in E minor, we might be expecting to see some D sharp, some raised leading notes, raised seventh degrees of the scale. Actually, well, we've got the odd D, haven't we? And when we see them, they're D natural. So there's nothing to suggest that it's really in E minor. But you might already be looking at this thinking, well, hang on a minute, what are these C sharps about? Well, this chorale is doing something that happens in a number of Bach chorales, which is this, that we start the chorale in the tonic key, in this case G major, and the first phrase modulates to another key. Quite often when that happens in the first phrase, the second phrase brings us back to the original tonic key. Doesn't always happen that way. Quite often you might expect the first phrase to be in the tonic key, but sometimes you get this immediate modulation, which is often to the dominant key, and then sometimes you'll find that's followed by a second phrase that's bringing you back to the tonic key. So if we are kind of fairly convinced now that we're starting in G major, if we add C sharp into the mix, where's that taking us? The best thing to do is to think, I've already got F sharp, I've added C sharp to it. What's the key that's got F sharp and C sharp? D major. Could be B minor. If we've got B minor, we might be expecting some A sharps to be around, but in fairness, there's no A's at that point, so we don't know if it's A sharp or A natural. We've had an A natural there, but maybe it's still in G major at that point. So we could keep the jury out on that. And as is often the case when you do these harmonizations, there isn't simply one way of doing it. There's often more than one possibility. So you might decide that you are going to finish that first phrase in B minor. All I'd say is that G major to B minor is slightly less obvious than G major to D major to the dominant key. So it possibly is more obvious to take it to D major than to B minor. But that's just a passing thought. So we're looking to kind of come to a cadence in D major at the end of the first phrase. And then when we look at the second phrase, we're thinking, well, we're definitely back in G major, supertonic, tonic, second degree to the first degree. That's going to be that. And also we've got C natural here, which is cancelling those previous C sharps. So first job, get clear about what the cadences are going to be, which key we're going to be in. Okay, you might then decide you're going to sort of pencil in a little bit of something to do with the cadence and maybe putting in a bass part. So for example, you come to the last two chords of the first phrase and you might think, let me just change this. You might think we'll have maybe this in the bass. So we're maybe thinking a sort of 5-1 in D major. There are many more 5-1 cadences, perfect cadences in Bach, than there are plagal cadences going 4-1. Plagal cadences are not impossible, but the perfect cadences are usually stronger. You might think, well, actually, maybe we could go for a 5-1 finish in G at the end. So maybe that's another possibility, that we go 5-1. It may be that we could do something slightly more sophisticated at the end. And it's this: because we have a note just before the last note that's got 2 beats on it, it's always possible that Bach might have used 2 chords, one on each beat. Now, why do I say that? You can see essentially we've got crotchet movement or quarter note movement. So there's quite often going to be a different chord on each crotchet beat, each quarter note beat. You wouldn't necessarily have a new chord there just for that quaver, that 8th note, because that's a passing note or a passing tone. So you don't have to have a new chord for that. And in fact, if you change chords there, you could do, but it would make it move forwards very quickly. The harmonic rhythm would be fast. So we're essentially going through our chorale thinking every new beat, we're going to have a new chord. So, you know, you then look at this and think, well, just because we've got a note in the melody with 2 beats doesn't mean to say that we have to have one chord for 2 beats. We could. Perfectly possible, but it may be that we think maybe we could have 2 chords there. And there's a little trick that Bach loves to use that I'm going to share with you, and it's this: that we have a bass line that goes from the 4th degree of the scale to the 5th degree of the scale underneath that supertonic note. And what we actually do with the chords is that we go 2-7 in first inversion to 5. Okay, I'm calling that 2-7B, which is one of the chord numbering systems that we use around the world. If you've been brought up in a different tradition, you might well call that a 2-7-6. That's fine in a first inversion, same thing. So in other words, instead of just having one chord, we have 2 chords. Okay, well, if you're doing written exams, often you have to do these things away from the keyboard, but sometimes you're allowed to have access to the keyboard. It's good to be able to do it by hearing it in your head, but obviously if you need the keyboard, go for it. So what have we got so far? Well, bare bones or something, but here's our melody. We're in G major. 5-1 in D major. And then 2-7 first inversion, 5-1 in G major. Well, I don't know about you, I think that sounds quite good actually. Now, we could think, well, I'll leave it at that and go back and sort out the rest of it. Or you could think, well, maybe I'll start putting in some notes so I can feel as if we've got things moving on these chords. Well, if we're going to have a 2-7B 5-1 at the end, maybe we can do something like this. The great thing as well is we can commit ourselves to writing some notes, but we can always change them later if we don't like them. So how about we do something like this, and I'll use a little trick that Bach uses here, which I'll then explain. So do you see what I've written in that last bar? It's also making the point that you don't necessarily have to do these things sort of A to Z, starting at the beginning and going from one chord to the next. Sometimes the cadences are worth thinking about and then kind of working forwards and backwards. So what have I written in this last bar, this last measure? Okay, let's just examine that. So 2-7B, that's how that goes. Notice I've got this big space between the bass and the tenor, but the upper 3 parts are quite close together. When you're looking at four-part harmony, and these Bach chorale things in particular, it sort of looks like 2 and 2, doesn't it? You know, you've got soprano and alto and the treble clef, you've got tenor and bass and the bass clef. So it's easy to sort of think I'll have 2 parts running together there, 2 parts running together here. But if you end up with this kind of thing where you've got a huge space between the alto and the tenor part, then the texture doesn't work so well. And it sounds a bit thick and grumpy down in the tenor and bass parts as well. It also probably means your tenor part's going to be too low. So think of it not as 2 plus 2, but as 3 plus 1. So you see my upper 3 parts in that last bar are quite close together. And it's the bass that's separated. So even though it looks like 2 plus 2, if you think it 3 plus 1, that's often going to be a better result for you. And there's a word of technical advice when you're harmonizing: don't have more than an octave between 2 neighboring parts, except the tenor and the bass. So you can have this space between the tenor and the bass that we've got here. So for example, here we've got a tenth, haven't we? Here we've got a tenth, but the other parts are much more closely connected. So that's a word on spacing. Now, after that 2-7B, you can also feel that spacing of that 2-7B is quite satisfactory. It's rather nice having that second, that crunch in the alto part there, that then resolves. So you hear that G, F sharp. And when I go to the chord 5, I've then tucked in a little passing note in the tenor. Bach loves to do this. You get a chord 5, then you tuck in a passing note that happens to make it a 5-7. And then that 5-7 really pulls you onto the next tonic chord. So it's a great combination: 2-7 first inversion, 5-1, with a little passing note that's creating a 7th. So there we are. We've got a nice kind of cadence at the end. Sometimes when you get a little crunch like this dissonance here, you might just think it might be worth preparing that note on the previous chord. So you might think, well, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I'll bear in mind that it might be quite nice to have that G on the previous chord. You don't have to, but it's going to make for possibly a better line if you do that. So, you know, we'll just pencil that in for now, shall we, and see where it goes. Okay, now we might go back to the previous cadence and do a little bit of work on this one as well. So back up here, we've also got a 5-1 cadence. So, well, how are we going to deal with that? Well, we might come back and reorganize things, but how about this? And I'll show you another little technique for dealing with this 7th as well. And maybe having a shared note there. I'm doing this so I can kind of illustrate certain things that Bach does and certain things that are perfectly good practice that you might be thinking, is that okay to do? Well, what I've now written is a 5-1 in the key of D at the end of the first phrase. Doing something similar to what we did in the last phrase, but organising it slightly differently. Okay, so we've got the chord 5. Notice, first of all, I've got this shared A, tenor and bass. Is that okay? Yes, it is. Don't overdo it, but is it okay? Yes, it is. Why have I decided to do that? Well, if I'd had a C sharp in the tenor here, you know, if I'd gone for a C sharp, well, I've already got a C sharp there. And one thing we try to do, at least as much as we reasonably can, is to avoid doubling the major third of chords. Now, this is a slightly spurious thing, you know, it's often talked about as a rule, but I think it's rather more advisory than as a rule. And often Bach does double his major thirds, but he does it in particular places, which we'll come back to. But here, be better if we don't need to double that C sharp in the tenor, well, let's not. So there's some reason for using that A double, because there's nowhere else to go, is there really? And then you see what I've done in the alto. We've got this chord 5, but I'm thinking, well, where can I do this trick of adding the 7th as a passing note? Well, I can't do it in the tenor, I can't do it in the alto. But what I can do in the alto is to start on E and jump up to the 7th. So instead of it being a passing note like it was at the end, now we're jumping up to the 7th. And that also works well. So it's just another way of doing the same kind of trick. Now you might say to me, well, at the end, you didn't just go 5-1, you went 2/7 in first inversion, 5/1, and you said that Bach often does that. Yes, he does. Now, it was particularly obvious at the end because remember, we had this note with 2 beats. Now, here, this note doesn't have 2 beats, so we've got to be a little bit careful. But when we were here, we were going from the supertonic to the tonic. Different situation because now we're going from the leading note to the tonic. But the previous note was the tonic, and you might just think, is it possible to put a 2/7B in before the 5/1? Because if it is possible, it's often a good thing to do. Well, it does actually work. So how about we do something like this, and we have another one of these 2/7s in first inversion. Well, the D is part of the chord. The D in the melody that we can see at the top here is the 7th of that 2/7, isn't it? So 2/7 first inversion, 5/1. Now, isn't this great? Because it means we've got the last 3 chords in of each of the phrases. Do I need to worry about the fact that we've got exactly the same thing twice? 2/7B 5/1, 2/7B 5/1. If I'm doing this for an exam, isn't an examiner going to say, well, that's a bit boring, isn't it? No, the examiner's not going to say that. The examiner's going to say, well done. Bach often does 2/7 in first inversion 5/1, and it comes in different contexts. So you see here we've got a 2-beat supertonic followed by a tonic. Here we've got a tonic leading note tonic coming after each other, but the same formula still works. So if it goes in there, well, it might just be worth thinking that's worth using. Okay, so that's kind of got our 2 cadences in, and we kind of know we're in D major and G major, so that's kind of useful, isn't it? So let's now go back to the beginning and say, well, maybe we can do some work here. We know we're in the key of G major. We are starting with an anacrusis, so we're starting on the last beat of a bar, which sometimes means that it might begin on the dominant chord. It might go 5 and then go to 1 at the beginning of the next bar. That's not going to work here because chord 5 is a D major chord. D, F sharp, A, doesn't fit with G. So really, we've got to use chord 1, chord 6, or chord 4. Well, it's the very first chord. It's perfectly possible you might use a 6 or a 4, but it's probably stronger if you use 1. Okay, well, let's make that cool. Let's go for a chord 1. Okay, and then maybe let's just think, how are we going to space that? Often you might find it easier to fill in the bass line first and come back and do your middle parts later. Sometimes you kind of think, actually, I might just get all the notes in of this chord, and that helps me to see some direction of travel. Okay, if we're going to use chord 1 on the anacrusic note, we've then got to decide what comes on the first beat of the next bar. Now, there's an interesting thing here because you might think, oh, well, I've used chord 1, so now I'm definitely going to use chord 4 or chord 6 because those are the other 2 chords that contain the note G. So, you know, when you're looking to harmonize a note, we're looking for G. Just think, well, G is the root of something. In this case, it's the root of chord 1. It's the middle of something as well. So what's the middle of, the third of? Chord 6, and it's also the top of something. It's the 5th of something, in this case chord 4. So you might think, I've used chord 1, so I better use 6 or 4. You could do, there's nothing to say you shouldn't do that. On the other hand, we're now dealing with the first strong beat, haven't we? We've had this upbeat and now we've got a strong beat. So we're starting with a piece that goes and 1. And when it does that, the tonic chord is often the strongest thing to use. So is it okay to have the tonic chord twice? Surely that's a bit boring. Be better to change the chord. Well, yeah, but Bach often does use the tonic chord twice. You don't have to. This is the whole point. You could use a 6 or a 4. Absolutely fine. You could use 1 in a different inversion. That would be another possibility to do that. But you could just think, heck, I'm just going to use chord 1 again. If you are going to do that and use chord 1 again, here's a little trick. I repeat the notes that I had in the alto and the tenor parts, but I take the bass up an octave. Why am I doing that? Because it just gives us a sense of movement, the bass propelling up the octave. You hear that? G, G. It's just giving us a bit of energy across the bar line. If I just went, it would feel a bit stuck, wouldn't it? But I could go 1, 1 to 4. I could go 1 to 6. I could even put a passing note in the bass. G, F sharp, E. Perfectly reasonable thing to do. I'm just doing this because Bach often does. But you see what I mean? There's more than one possible way around it. But I'm also doing it to demonstrate that it's perfectly okay to use chord 1 across that initial bar line with an anacoustic start. But if you do, leap the bass an octave, it normally works better. Another good reason for using that is that we're trying to get as much contra-motion as we can between the top and the bottom, and also sometimes looking for kind of scale work to balance the leaps in the bass. So we've had a big leap in the bass. How about we now think about how we're going to move on? Well, we're possibly going to use a chord 5 under this A, because that's the 5th of that chord 5. We don't really want to use chord 7, which is another possibility. Chord 2 wouldn't be great. Why wouldn't chord 2 be great? Well, if I were to kind of write an A in the bass to use chord 2, I'm going to get octaves between the soprano and the bass. That's going to be a bad idea. And as soon as you've got the bass and the soprano going in the same direction, certainly using the same notes, you can have trouble with these consecutives or parallels, as they're sometimes known. Consecutive octaves, parallel octaves, consecutive fifths, parallel fifths. So worth avoiding that. Chord 7 is a bit of a tricky one because perfectly reasonable to use a chord 7, but it's a diminished chord, so we need to be a bit careful how we use it. And when we use those diminished chords, they're always better in first inversion. So if I use 7 in first inversion, I'm going to have exactly the same problem. I'm going to have A there and I'm going to have octaves. So do you see why I'm thinking on balance that chord 5 is better? We also want to think about balancing our inversions. So I'm going to suggest that we perhaps use chord 5 in first inversion. Why? We've had 2 root positions, so let's have a first inversion. Also, it means the bass can move by step. So having had this octave leap, it then goes by step, which is rather nice. Okay, now then, is it possible for that bass line to carry on going by step? Well, it sure is. And is there some other advantage in it? Yes, there is. Why? Because we're looking for a pivot chord to take us from G major to D major. So a chord that we find in G major and that we find in D major. So it's common to the 2 keys. We use it as a pivot chord. So everything to the left of the pivot chord belongs to the previous key. Everything to the right of the pivot chord belongs to the new key. Now, I'm very cognizant of the fact that this C sharp is looming fast. So we need to have our pivot done before that C sharp comes. That C sharp is saying, we're in the new key, guys. Let's just confirm that with a C sharp. So we need to find a note, a chord, that fits with this. And what I'm thinking about this situation is a chord of E minor would do very nicely. Because why is the chord of E minor useful? Well, it's chord 6 in G major, but it's also chord 2 in D major, which is where we're heading. So that is our pivot chord. So that's what we're thinking about. Now, having done that, the bass could then move on by step to D. So you see we've got this lovely scale now on the bass. Having had that octave, we're now going down the scale. We're also going in contra-motion with the soprano. You see how these outer parts are moving out and then they come back in towards each other, then move out again. That's always going to help you avoid those parallels, those consecutives, if you can do that. What's the most obvious chord to use? Well, we've used the pivot chord, so now we can think in the key of D, chord 1. Brilliant. Now we've got the whole of the first phrase sorted out now. All we now need to do is fill in the missing middle parts. When you're moving from one chord to the next, it's quite often a good idea to say, is there a common note between one chord and the next? So the alto's on D, and then I can use D again because D was in that chord 1, wasn't it? D belongs to this chord 1 and D also belongs to this chord 5. So if I use that in the same part as a common note, that's going to smooth out the part writing. You know, I could have written a D in the tenor part, but then the tenor jumps up to a D. Then where does the alto go? It maybe jumps up to F sharp. That gives us a double major third with the bass. So then we've got to fix that. Starts to get messy. The common note helps us by having some stability between one chord and the next. And it also helps other parts to go slightly more smoothly, because if I do that, then I can have an A in the tenor part. And so that's all now moving on quite nicely, isn't it? Okay, well, I'm now looking for this E minor, this pivot chord, and I'm thinking maybe of doing something like this. There are other possibilities, I think, but that would give us a nice kind of smooth progression onto where we're going, wouldn't it? And amazingly, that then completes the first phrase. So what does the first phrase sound like? Okay, now I'm not trying to make life over complicated at the moment. I'm just thinking about good solid chord choice, how we make that modulation work. Get the contramotion between the top and the bottom organized, kind of smooth part writing. It all goes quite well, doesn't it? The parts sound all right. We've heard the melody, the alto part. Leap up and then step back inside the leap. Alto parts are often a little bit boring. And that's often a sign of good harmony. This one, you've got the 3 Ds at the beginning. Actually, it's not that boring. It's quite interesting, really, as far as alto parts go, but it's kind of fairly smooth. You see what I mean? We're not jumping all over the landscape. When we do have a leap, like we do at this point, we then step back within the leap, you know? The tenor part. It's kind of nice and stable, isn't it? Repeated notes and stepwise movement. A bass line. The contramotion, the downward scale, and then up for the cadence and down again. Means it has quite a nice shape, doesn't it? Okay, so that's our first phrase done. Now, when we move on to the second phrase, we're immediately thinking, well, now we've got to get back to G. Where's the pivot chord going to be? Well, we could say we've got this D major chord there. That could be a pivot, couldn't it? It's 1 in D. It's 5 in G, so we could go straight for there. So it's not going to be too difficult to do. We could say, well, I'll have a G major chord there because that's chord 4 in D, it's chord 1 in G. So you've got a choice about where you might position a pivot chord. Sometimes you think, well, it could be this chord, or that chord. That's fine. Sometimes you think it's going to have to be here. That's the only place I can put it. We've got a bit of space for maneuver. So now I'm going to suggest a little touch that Bach often uses, and it's a rather nice thing to do. And it's this, we're going to use something called a secondary dominant. So we're going to go 5 to 1 in the key of A minor. What am I doing now? Okay, let's think about this. When we look at this chord here, and we're thinking that's an A minor chord, well, the chord of A minor is chord 2 in the key of G major, which is where we want to be, isn't it? Okay, so if you've got a chord in a key and you can put the dominant of that chord on the previous note, so you go 5-1 in A minor, but the 1 in A minor is a chord in G major, chord 2 in this case, then you're using something called a secondary dominant. It adds a bit of colour to your writing, which is quite fun, and it might just make life a little bit less boring than just saying, well, we've gone to D major, now we've come back to G major. You know, it kind of goes somewhere else on the way. So if I just pin a bass line in there, I'm going to do this. So it gives me a secondary dominant into A minor. Okay. Let's fill in the alto and tenor parts just for completion. You may not want to do it this way. You may want to get the rest of the bass part in. That's all absolutely fine. And as I say, you can always change your mind. But here, listen to the effect of that secondary dominant. I'll play from the beginning. This gives a rather nice kind of push into A minor, isn't it? And then we want to come back to G major. So, okay, now I've got that 5-1 in A minor. I'm also thinking in the key of G, this is chord 2. Now, if we can get some stepwise movement in the bass again, that would be good. If we can keep some contramotion going with the soprano part, that would be good. So is there anything we can do here? Well, let's have a look at this. And I'm going to do this on purpose to demonstrate something else in a minute. Okay, now what am I doing here? Well, I'm using chord 1 in the key of G in first inversion, and I'm going to chord 5, and then in between, I've just slipped in a passing note. Bach loves to use his passing notes, so why not get some of those in? Okay, now some of you who are thinking about something I've already said are going to say, well, that's all very well, but isn't this a double major third? And you told us we shouldn't do that. Absolutely right. What I said was that it's not really a rule, more advisory, trying to avoid these double major thirds, but Bach often uses them. Where does Bach use them? Often when he's writing a scale passage. So you see this bass is going up the scale and the soprano part is coming down the scale. So if you've got two parts kind of converging like that in a scale-like passage and you have a double major third, Bach would rather double the major third than try to avoid it and kind of lose the strength of that line. So that's why I'm doing that. Let's fill in these other parts just so we've got that there. Again, see the use of the common note in the tenor. Do you see what I'm doing here? That D is part of chord 1, it's part of chord 5, we met that before, so repeat it in the same part. And then it makes everything else quite stable. You know, the alto's moving by step alongside the soprano, the tenor's repeating, the bass is going by step, or rather comfortable. Talking of passing notes, if ever you see a melodic third somewhere, there's always the possibility of a passing note. You don't have to ram them in everywhere you see a melodic third, but we could, for example, do this in the alto part there, just to have a little passing note in between that E and the G. The other thing is, even though Bach is writing solid homophonic 4-part harmony, he can't help being a contrapuntalist. And can you see what we've done? We've got this little figure, this, which gets copied in the bass. So there's just a little hint of something vaguely contrapuntal going on there. So why not use that opportunity? Now, we talked about this G being in the alto. We don't have to have it there, but it helps prepare us for this little crunch that we've got in the next bar. So if we've got a G and a B, well, this is telling us that we're either using chord 1 or using chord 6. Now, we could use a chord 6, but I'll tell you, if you do, there's going to be big trouble, because if we go for chord 6, we'll end up with this E in the bass. What's that going to do? It's going to give us fifths with the soprano. Perfect fifth followed by a perfect fifth. Can't do that. So that's not such a clever idea. So is there anything else that we could do? Well, we could maybe just say, let's just go for a chord 1. Let's keep ourselves out of trouble and go for a chord 1. And then, common note in the tenor, and that fills out the rest of that chord very nicely. And hey presto, we've finished harmonizing a chorale. What does it all sound like? Were there other things we could have done? Absolutely. We've talked about some of them. Could it be more elaborate? Yes, it could be. Does it work? Yes, I think it does. Does it sound like Bach? Yes, it does. So there we are. Just a few tips there, actually working through a chorale together as part of this video. Hopefully helps you to see how you might go about this task. So if you're one of those poor music students facing an exam in the writing of Bach chorales, I hope that's helpful to you. If you're just somebody wanting to know a bit more about writing decent 4-part harmony, that should also be helpful to you. So I hope you've enjoyed that. If you have, you might want to go to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. If you click on courses, you will find a Bach chorale course. So if this is something you're needing to do, I'd strongly recommend going to that course, and you'll get much more detail. All the rules explained, all the ins and outs of writing in the Bach chorale style, and that will help you get where you need to be. Other things out there as well, if you're wanting to strengthen your theory or your harmony or your oral skills, analysis, orchestration, have a look, see what we've got to offer there. Also, while you're there, click on Maestros on the homepage, because you might be interested in joining our Global Maestros program. Lots of perks come with that. And if you decide to join at level 2, you can, as amongst other things, come along to our monthly live stream, where I'll be doing a good solid hour of teaching each month, and we can go into much more detail on the topics such as that we've been covering here. If you're a composer or a performer, or wanting to submit your own compositions, harmony, performances, you might want to join level 3, where you can do just that, submit your work, and then I'll evaluate it, and you'll get one-to-one feedback, and we'll share it in a group, run a live chat, and that's a very supportive community where we all learn a great deal from each other. Anyway, it's all there if you want it at www.mmcourses.co.uk.